Starting us off, we have Sister Natalie Mehra from the Ontario Health Coalition, who was a long-time campaigner in opposition to the privatization of healthcare and hospitals, and she has been waging many battles, one of them including this one, coming to terms with the role that pension plans are playing. So we've asked her to offer kind of a snapshot of what they have been doing and the efforts to challenge P3s, as we call them, public-private partnerships, particularly in healthcare, but I think she'll offer comments on what they look like as a model and how it has been politicized in the last number of years and how it has been growing, really, extending not just in Ontario but across the country.
So Pat Armstrong from York University has a joke that she tells, and I have stolen it from her. And so what she says, she tells this joke. It's about a construction site in which a construction worker leaves at the end of every day. He leaves the site and he wheels out a wheelbarrow, and it's covered in a tarp. And at the end of every day, the supervisors go through the site, top to bottom. They can't figure out what he's stealing. They can't find anything missing. They can't figure it out. And so he does this every day for 2 weeks. He leaves at the end of the shift. He wheels out a wheelbarrow, and it's covered in a tarp, and they look and they can't find anything. And so finally they say to him, look, we're not going to call the police, we're not going to fire you, but tell us, what is it that you're stealing in your wheelbarrow covered with a tarp? And he says, wheelbarrows. And Pat uses this to illustrate how, in many ways, our public services are being sort of stolen out from underneath us in ways that are not immediately visible. And I think P3s are one of the very successful examples of this type of privatization. But P3s are also part of kind of a wholesale attempt, as you know, to privatize the ownership and operation of public services. But what you may not be as familiar with, but is also the attempt to privatize the culture of public services themselves, the kind of insidious privatization, the marketization of the operations of public services and the values that underlie them. Anyway, the history of infrastructure development in Canada, it started out for hospitals anyways, and I think to some extent this is similar in schools and in some other major public services, that they were charitable. Where they existed, it would be the Grey Nuns or other religious or charitable organizations that created institutions, wealthy families that donated houses and so on. And I suppose it is a measure of kind of the unfettered greed in our sort of current world, the extent to which people expect tax returns and so on and so forth for charitable giving these days, or they expect the kind of returns that they're looking at from P3s, which really are gargantuan returns. But so the history in Canada is that there was a period in which charitable and religious institutions created our public hospitals. And then there was a period in which the federal government got actively involved in the 1940s, when actually, ironically, Paul Martin Sr., so the recent Prime Minister Paul Martin's father, when he was Minister for National Health and Welfare, created the National Grants Program. And in his biography I was reading, it's interesting, at the time the Liberals were quite visionary about nation building in a way. And so he understood that we needed an infrastructure of hospitals in order to attract physicians and health professionals into underserved regions and so on, and in order to underlie what he really wanted to bring in, which was a national healthcare program, a public insurance program for healthcare for Canada. And so the first step was the National Health Grants Program, and it offered to communities, the federal governments would provide matching funds to provincial governments, donations to them to build facilities. So in that way they kind of blackmailed, sorry, bad word, but I'm not sure what other word I should use, the provinces into having to fund this infrastructure. And though the provinces didn't like this federal incursion into their territory at the beginning, certainly very quickly, this program became very popular, these 50-cent dollars as they got to be known. And by 1971, about 90% of what was in 1990s the total capacity of our hospital system had been built through the National Health Grants Program. So it was an incredibly successful program. And then there was a windup in national funding, and actually we didn't need new hospital beds. We in fact probably overbuilt hospital beds. And so there was no real crisis, and I think that runs parallel in some other sectors too. There had been this period of building, and then there were enough, basically. And then really in the 1990s, with the major cuts agenda, and ironically, Paul Martin Sr., right, started it at the federal level with his, Mulrooney started it with the de-indexing of the tax system and so on, but probably vastly accelerated by Paul Martin Jr., as I'm going to call him, with his 1995 budget and the $32 billion announced in cuts to transfers to provinces. And then in Ontario, of course, we led the country in cuts because the Harris government wanted to institute what they called 30% tax cuts on top of that, right? And so major cutting. And one of the deficits that arose from that, in addition to the visible deficit, was a really very significant infrastructure deficit. And so as the infrastructure of hospitals, many of them built in the 1940s and 50s, started to crumble, at the same time the government wasn't funding even maintenance. Most hospitals actually during the period of the Harris government were, certainly by the second term of the Harris government, were so low on cash that they had used their cash reserves to meet payroll. So they certainly were not doing, and there were crises in which hospitals were saying, they were worried about meeting their payroll. That's how bad the hospital deficits got. And so they certainly weren't even doing upkeep maintenance, let alone building new infrastructure. And so Hugh Mackenzie put together a bunch of slides. I won't go into detail, but this just sort of serves to show the decline in investment in public infrastructure and the growth of the infrastructure deficit. Go ahead. So you'll just sort of see, and then as Hugh points out, go ahead, Kevin. Sorry. The fiscal imbalance actually really more than on any other level of government was dumped on the municipal governments, and so through downloading of housing responsibilities and other responsibilities, transportation, other responsibilities from the federal government and the provinces, they moved funding for a more and more significant chunk of infrastructure or the obligation to fund it from the government with the most revenue flexibility to the one with really the least. And this, of course, sort of compounded the crisis. So it really is, create a crisis and privatize, that same old sort of situation, and quite a plan. Go ahead. So what are P3? So out of this period of constraint, this idea, which was really, which I think Brian is going to talk about more, really came from the UK, was forged by multinational financial institutions, is a plan to sort of move in and sell to governments a way to address their mounting infrastructure deficits. And so what they created was a new sort of term called public-private partnerships, which is really about privatizing the financing of infrastructure. They have created a definition that includes everything from privatizing single services to full ownership privatization. But in truth, the new thing that they really did in this period was create this model that would to attract governments to privatizing the financing of infrastructure. And it's actually really brilliant. It's incredibly complex, and really, they're smart, these guys. And so they attach a whole bunch of additional revenue streams to the core financing deal. and they bundle it in for 30 years as a rule. Sorry, can you go back? And they called it public-private partnerships because these are nice sounding words, and it downplays the privatization, et cetera, et cetera. But they go by a whole bunch of different terms. In Britain, they were called Private Finance Initiative, or PFI. When the British Medical Association Journal coined them perfidious financial idiocy, they dropped that name and they went with P3s. In Ontario, they were called P3s. And when we had completely discredited them, and I'm going to take credit for that, through plebiscite campaigns, in which 100,000 people now have voted against, more than 100,000, against P3 privatization of their local hospitals, they changed the name to alternate financing and procurement and alternate financing mechanism. So there's a whole bunch of names, and I saw merchant model or merchant mechanism or something was being used in Nova Scotia. There's a bunch of different names for them, but basically they're all the same thing. And where there are minor changes, like in Ontario, the government has said that they're maintaining ownership of the structures. All they've done is put a sort of superstructure over the P3 in which the provincial government leases the whole structure and the deal to the private sector for $1, and they lease it back for $1. What that means is that the provincial government keeps title. It also keeps liability, and it also means that the companies can evade taxes in an interesting way. Anyway, this is from the P3 industry itself, and it's their sort of look at the world. This would have been in the early 2000s, and the infrastructure backlog all around the world. So this is their sort of quick assessment of how they could grow. And this is these are highlights again in the early 2000s of what they had achieved by that point. And if you were to see this now, it would be exponentially fuller of these little pull-out boxes. I mean, they have grown enormously, really shockingly enormously. And so what is a P3? A P3 is a situation in which your local hospital or your local school or what have you is built by a consortium, which is a group of private companies. So there'll be usually there'll be a financier, and they're multinational generally. There'll be a construction company, there'll be an architect, and there'll be some kind of property developer and service privatizer involved. And most of these are really big international companies. In most of the hospital P3s in Canada, many of the school ones, etc. Carillion, for example, from Britain, is the service privateer. You've seen Aecon signs on the highway. They're involved in these up to their eyeballs. There's only about 6 construction companies in Ontario that can build projects of this complexity and size. And then there's a handful of multinational financiers, Deutsche Bank, the pension plans, some of the banks. And there's a lot of architects who don't want to get involved in these. These players are too big. It's too tough, as I was told by one architecture firm, to work these deals with these companies. And so they're actually really, there's like Perkins, and there's like a number of, there's Oxford Property Management. There really aren't that many companies involved in these. And the key players, there's actually a small number, which makes you wonder, why would you run an RFP process? Why would you run a tendering process when there really isn't much competition? It's interesting. Anyways, because why it's really interesting is because the prices of P3s, the prices of infrastructure, in 13 years at the Ontario Health Coalition have more than quadrupled with the bringing in of the P3s. Like on a price per foot basis, that is supposed to be the cost driver if you're building a building. So if in 1 year a hospital costs, like a big hospital in a community costs $250,000, but 3 years later, that same size of hospital is costing $250 million, is costing $600 million. What the heck is going on? Well, that's what's happened over the bringing in of the P3s. So the way it works, they build the building, they then get paid off for the building in 30 or 60 or 90-year deals. 90 years in the case of the 407, 30 to 60 years for the building infrastructure. And they attach into that real estate deal service privatization, land development, and other revenue streams. So typically in the hospital deal, there's the growth clause that I call it, which says that the hospital boards cannot unreasonably withhold their approval for additional business opportunities and ventures that the P3 consortium proposes over the 30-year duration of the deals. So there's this ever-expanding thing. So say you wanted to like run the steam plant and sell, I don't know, electricity out of it, out of the hospital. You could, the hospital board wouldn't be able to unreasonably withhold that. And in cases like in Niagara, where the former hospital CEO raised to our attention that the P3 consortium had actually been given the nuclear, the license, right? Because hospitals use radioactivity in the P3 deal. He was livid about it. He couldn't believe that they would do, that the province would actually do that. These could have bigger and bigger and bigger implications. But at the end of the day, it's a leaseback construction deal in which they have attached all kinds of other revenue streams from which they can make profit. Generally, they're not interested in building new wings. They want the whole hospital because it's actually very hard to run the services where they end at the end of a hallway and actually make any money, right? So that's what they've done. And in hospitals, they've said that we're not going to privatize the clinical services. We're just going to privatize all of the support services. And we've actually fought that successfully, and we've stopped it. They have a number of models: design, build, finance, operate. So this lists what is privatized: the design, the build, the financing, and the operation. The designers answer to the financiers, and so on and so forth. And lawyer Stephen Schreiman described this to me is this way. Each of the companies in the consortium have their own set of lawyers. They come together into the group and form the consortium, with each company directing its lawyers who negotiate their consortium deal to maximize their profits and minimize their risk. And then that consortium has its set of lawyers, and then they sit down with your local hospital board or what have you and negotiate the 30 or 60-year deal for building the new hospital. And their goal is to maximize their profit and minimize their risk. And they do these deals all over the world. And frankly, our local hospital boards, and to the extent that our provincial government is involved, is just not defending the public interest in these deals. And in truth, if you go into the provincial government, one of the things that the companies have done is, as part of the P3 program, is actually create an infrastructure in government to promote P3s. So Partnerships BC, they have like a partnerships whatever in many of the provinces. In Ontario, it's called Infrastructure Ontario. And every single person I've ever met from there is actually recruited from one of the industries that benefits from P3s. David Livingston, who was the head of Infrastructure Ontario from the inception till just recently, came from TD Bank, for example. I don't know who the new head is, but I'm sure they're from a bank. Everyone that I met in there is from the construction industry or the financial industry or what have you. So it's not a question really, and they're the ones who govern the negotiation of the deals and just decide whether or not they show value for money. There are no true audits, not one, of any P3 in Ontario. There never have been, except for the one that we won after a 4-year court battle with some of the unions and us to force disclosure, and eventually a full-on confrontation with the minister on the agenda, in which I accused them of not doing any audits of them, finally resulted in the Public Accounts Committee holding the audit of the Brampton P3, which found that it cost $200 million just on the financing, more than if it were to be built publicly. This was a hospital that was supposed to cost $250 million in total. It was $200 million more just on the financing for the private finance initiative. Sorry. And so what is the role of the pension plans? Well, unfortunately, I don't think that the P3 program would exist. I mean, about half of it, more probably, I'm guessing that this would be wiped out, were not for pension plans funding these infrastructure projects. I mean, you actually have to be able to underwrite the building of a huge building and be paid off for it over 30 years or 60 years or what have you, in order to be able to do this. So really, when you look around the world, the financial institutions that are willing and able to engage in these consortia and do this, there's not that many. In Ontario, though, the pension plans are increasingly involved in all kinds of healthcare privatization. So they have been involved in many of the P3 deals. At this point, Rivera Nursing Homes, one of the largest nursing home chains in Ontario, sold out to the federal employees pension plan, and you know, just
100%.
yeah, just so that you know, the for-profit nursing homes have fought against things like minimum care standards to improve the care in nursing homes for a decade. I mean, we have fought them tooth and nail over this for more than a decade. 21% of the private clinics in Ontario, the what's so-called independent health facilities, the private for-profit clinics that have privatized hospital and doctor services to corporations, 21% are owned by pension plans. So the long-term care P3s in Ontario, they are P3s in which the private sector builds and owns the long-term care facility. The province pays them in 20-year, by giving them 20-year licenses, and at the end of it, and guaranteed stream of income for 20 years, and at the end of it, they own the asset and the land that we've paid to build, and paid them to operate for 20 years at their own profit. The hospital P3s, now independent health facilities, and they're involved in the laboratories and laboratory privatization and so on. I don't think I need to get into that. So can we just switch to the other
Sure.
slideshow?
So it's
There we are.
one of those.
Yeah, that one.
This one?
Yeah. And you can just, from the beginning, and we'll just run as I'm talking.
Okay.
So the consequences of these are very dramatic. Not only do they rob us of democratic governance, of public sector public sector workplaces and public services, but they bifurcate. So they split in half. The services, half of them operated at least on a for-profit basis, half on a not-for-profit basis or public interest basis. These two things do not work well together. They often result in huge legal wrangling and problems. They have resulted in many bankruptcies. This is not just a few, but many bankruptcies that have deprived communities of schools or hospitals or other services. Currently in England, 7 giant, these are very large hospitals, are teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. The government has had to bail them out because of high P3 costs, and 21 or 22 in total are considered at high risk for bankruptcy. This is a financial program that is completely unsustainable. It's so expensive. The monthly charges to these consortia are massive. And what happens in tight times is that in a hospital, for example, if all of your services are privatized and the infrastructure itself, if you're bound into unitary costs for those and you have to make budget cuts, where do you cut? The only thing you can cut is doctors and nurses. That's all you've got left. That's the only thing that the hospital board controls. Everything else has been given away in guaranteed stream of payments for 30 years to the private sector consortia. It fundamentally changes the terms of the public sector, both for the public and for the employees in that sector. And so here we are in this weird situation where unionized workers' pension plans are one of the key, if not the key funder of these projects. And yet here we are, pulling mass campaigns together with the unions to try and fight these projects and their damage to the public interest and to their very own workforces. It is a contradiction that is extraordinary.
Very good. Thank you, Natalie. Just to link us to Brian, I'll just extract one interesting kind of way of looking at this. Natalie's presentation covered really not just the healthcare P3s, but the logic, of course, applies to all of the forms. And the critique, of course, is very much a public policy critique. This is bad for healthcare, bad for the services, and also a rip-off of the taxpayer, governments, and something that is structured to favor the investor. Well, of course, if you think about it from the investor perspective, from the pension fund investment perspective, I know that, speaking from trustees and people that are faced with proposals that come to pension plan boards for exciting new investments in infrastructure, that's what they're called, infrastructure as an alternative asset class. And they present these rates of return of 8 to 15%, sometimes potential for more. And pension governing boards are in a position to have to evaluate that and get into the discussion of the risk characteristics of it.
Sorry, Kevin, I'm not going to be here for the Q&A,
Yeah,
but there's
please.
one key point.
Please feel free.
Sorry, it's just 1 second.
Come on up here. Please.
So in 2008, when the financial meltdown happened, of course, Deutsche Bank and some of the other large financiers, and actually financiers for extended care, all of the building of long-term care home beds, even ones that have been awarded in Ontario, basically ground to a halt. The P3s ground to a halt. And you know, there was a capital crisis. There was no money available to them to continue. And at that time, there was a giant hospital project in Niagara, the St. Catharines P3 project, that was held sort of stuck in limbo in the middle of this. And this is a really, you know, it's a 350 bed hospital. It's a big hospital to be a regional hospital for the area. And Deutsche Bank was the funder, supposed to be the financier for it, but they couldn't get the capital to build it. And so after many months of delay, finally, I got a call from a union leader who told me that OMERS had called him to ask, you know, would we support OMERS stepping in to prop up this P3 deal in Niagara. So I said, absolutely not. No way in hell. You know, we're not going to do that. And so they went back. In the end, they got a couple of banks to do it. But what's interesting about that was that that the P3s actually were crumbling at that time. I mean, it really did. And in Britain, I don't know if Brian's going to deal with this, but the British government had to bail out their own P3 projects. I mean, at the end of it, they owned something like 40% of their own P3 projects, for which they were paying an exorbitant fee to themselves, circuitously, in order to just keep this fiasco going. It was completely shocking. And what's his name, wrote the Enron like financing column for P3s. I mean, it really was wild. But P3s were on their knees at that point. And at that point, it was actually the pension plans that moved in to help prop them up and keep them going, at least in Ontario.
Very interesting. Well, that's a helpful additional point, and I'll just add to that, that for those of you that read the John Loxley article that we put on the recommended reading list, one of his main observations, this is the end of 2012, he points out, he talks about this liquidity crisis in 2009 and how things were grinding to a halt. And the P3 development process did slow for a period of time, but his whole paper basically shows that that was a blip, and if you look at the last 2-3 years, it is back to where it was and beyond. So, you know, we didn't get saved by the crisis. Greg?
Just to clarify what Natalie was just saying, so when the P3s have been having bankruptcy problems in Britain, since we haven't as many here, the shakeout of this is working, that the public sector isn't taking it on completely. They're taking a step, but they're also then bringing in the pension plans to support kind of the shakeout and trying to reestablish the financial basis of whatever was the P3.
Well, I mean, that was what was tried in Niagara. But I don't know how the British government funded out, you know, I mean, I don't know what they did. But, you know, when they stepped in and they basically, I'm trying to remember the details. Anyway, I don't know that if they used pension plan money to do that.
But in the case in Niagara, that's what they did.
They tried to do it, they said no. And I think the union intervened and helped stop it.
Notable that the UK government, just on the theme, that they sold off the Royal Mail a month ago. And they made a very big deal about the fact that the buyers of the equity in the Royal Mail was going to be responsible long-term investors. And what that really meant was pension funds were going to essentially scoop up the undervalued equity in the Royal Mail.